Somewhere beneath the wild grasses of the Mongolian steppe, in a place deliberately hidden from every map ever drawn, lies the unmarked grave of the most consequential conqueror in human history. He was born with nothing, abandoned by his own clan at the age of 9, enslaved, humiliated, and left to die on an open plain that showed mercy to no one. Yet, within the span of a single lifetime, this forgotten child would reshape the borders of nearly every nation that exists on Earth today. Medieval historians recorded his story in fire and ruin, choosing carefully what the world would remember and what it would be allowed to forget. But buried beneath centuries of deliberate silence is another story entirely. One of radical tolerance, revolutionary law, and a communications network so advanced it would not be surpassed for 600 years. Tonight, we travel back to the frozen steppe of 1162, where a boy is born into a world that does not yet know it is about to end. Welcome, dear traveler, to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing and leaving a like so more stories can find their way to you. What time is it where you are tonight? And which corner of the world are you watching from? And before we begin, tell me this. Did you ever wonder how a forgotten orphan on a frozen steppe came to reshape every border of the modern world? Chapter 1. The Boy the Steppe Tried to Kill. Far to the north of the Gobi Desert, where the earth stretches open in every direction, and the sky seems too vast to hold, there lies a land of rolling grass and silence. In the 12th century, the Mongolian steppe was neither gentle nor forgiving. It was a place of sharp extremes, summers that burned dry and brief, lasting only 60 to 90 days before retreating, and winters of devastating cold that could fall to 20 degrees below zero, carrying blizzards that buried the land for months at a time. The rains were scarce, rarely more than the span of a man's hand in depth across an entire year. And when the cold came down too hard, or the snow lay too deep for the animals to reach the grass beneath, entire herds would die in what the people of the steppe called a zud, a great winter killing. The land received roughly 10% forest, a bare fraction suitable for any settled farming, and the rest was open pasture, river valley, and desert fringe. Into this ancient, unyielding world, a boy was born, somewhere near the Onon River, in the shadow of the Keraites mountains, and the steppe would spend the first years of his life trying, in many ways, to undo him. Among the clans that moved across this vast land, life was organized not by kings or courts, but by blood. Mongol society in the 12th century was built around the clan, a group of families bound by a common male ancestor, moving together, herding together, fighting together. Clans gathered into larger confederations, and within each clan, authority followed the line of descent with careful precision. The eldest among the closest relations to the founding ancestor held the highest standing. At communal feasts, the order in which a man was seated and the portion of meat placed before him announced his place in the world without a single word needing to be spoken. Lineage was everything. Marriage was carefully controlled. A man took a wife from outside his own clan, and in doing so, his family formed a bond with hers, weaving the web of alliances that held the steppe together. Sons remained within their father's clan. daughters departed to cement new ties. To know one's exact genealogy was not merely a matter of pride, but of political survival. A man without a recognized lineage had no standing, no protection, and no claim. Into this world of blood and belonging, Temujin entered, born of a line that carried both great promise and, through the cruelty of circumstance, profound danger. Temujin was most likely born around the year 1162, near the place called Delun Boldog on the banks of the Onon River, in the heart of what is now northern Mongolia's Keraites Mountains. Scholars have debated this date across generations, with some medieval chronicles suggesting 1155 and others pointing to 1167, but the year 1162 remains the broad consensus, aligning most naturally with the known sequence of events that would follow in his life. His father was Yasugai the Brave, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of considerable standing within the Kamag Mongol Confederation. His mother was Hoelun, a woman of the Olkonud clan, originally of the Ongirat tribe. According to Mongol tradition, as recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, Temujin entered the world with a blood clot clenched inside his small fist, a sign the shamans and elders believed of a child chosen by the spirits for a powerful destiny. That sealed grip was said to speak of unbreakable vitality, of hands that would one day seize and hold forces greater than any ordinary man could touch. Whether one reads this as omen or as story, the image endures. A child born already holding something that would not let go. Yasugai the Brave was not simply Temujin's father. He was, at the time of the boy's birth, the most powerful Mongol prince of his era. A grandson of Kabul Khan, the man who had once been acknowledged as ruler of the Kamag Mongol Confederation, Yasugai led the Kiat subclan of the Borjigin and exercised the highest authority among his people. He had forged a sworn brotherhood, the sacred bond called Anda, with Togril of the powerful Keraites tribe, a relationship that lent him strength and reach across the steppe. His reputation as a warrior was formidable. Children on the steppe were raised in the saddle almost before they could walk. By the age of 2 or 3, they balanced on horses with their knees and body weight alone, and by 7 or 8 they were already learning the short bow and the hunt. Temujin, like every child of his world, would have learned the steppe's rhythms young, how to tend animals, how to read weather, how to handle a weapon. The son of a great chieftain, he was being shaped by birthright and by training into a leader. But the steppe does not honor plans, and the forces gathering against Yasugai's family would soon strip everything away. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yasugai made a journey to the camp of the Kongirad noble Dei Sechen to arrange a betrothal for his son. Dei Sechen was the chief of the Boskur clan of the Kongirad, and his daughter Borte, described in the secret history of the Mongols as having light in her face and fire in her eyes, was considered a fitting match for the boy who bore Yasugai's blood. The betrothal negotiations carried weight far beyond the union of 2 young people. Between the 2 families, ceremonial gifts were exchanged, knuckle bones and arrows, and Temujin was left behind in Dei Sechen's household, as custom required, to work in service and honor the bond. The alliance between the Borjigin and the Kongirad clans was not merely personal, it was political. It gave Temujin a powerful network at a moment when networks were the difference between survival and ruin. The black marten fur coat that would later come with Borta as part of her dowry would prove to have significance beyond its warmth. It would be used to secure a crucial alliance in the difficult years ahead. But before any of those future uses could be reached, fate intervened. Yasuge set out on the journey home and never arrived. On the road home from Dei Sechen's camp, Yasuge passed a Tatar encampment where a wedding celebration was underway. He attempted to join the feast without revealing his identity, knowing that his history with the Tatars was lethal. Years before, he had killed one of their chieftains during a raid. The Tatars recognized him, and quietly, without confrontation, they slipped poison into his food. Yasuge managed to leave the camp and limp back toward his own people. But by the time he reached them, the poison was already doing its slow, irreversible work. He called for his son. A messenger went to bring Temujin back from Dei Sechen's household. But Yasuge did not live long enough to see him. He died shortly after returning. The most powerful Mongol chieftain of his age, undone not in battle, but at a feast table. In the world of the 12th century steppe, raiding was not merely theft. It was a social language, a way of settling debts, demonstrating power, and enforcing vengeance. Between the Tatars and the Borjigin, that language had been spoken for years. Now it had spoken its most devastating sentence. Temujin, still a child, was left without the man whose name and reputation had been his greatest shield. With Yasuge gone, the world did not pause to grieve. The Kiad clan abandoned Hoelun and her children almost immediately. In the ruthless arithmetic of steppe politics, a widow and a group of young children held no military value, no resources worth guarding, no political leverage worth maintaining. The family was cast out, left to survive on the margins of the land that had once been their father's domain. Hoelun, who had herself once been abducted from another man to become Yasuge's wife, now became the sole provider for her children. The secret history of the Mongols records her response to this abandonment without melodrama. She simply did what the land required. She foraged for wild roots and nuts. She hunted small animals. She fished the rivers and streams of the steppe. She drew upon the deep survival knowledge that nomadic life had always demanded. The understanding of which plants were edible and when, which animals could be caught and how, which water sources held fish through the cold seasons. This was not passive endurance. This was deliberate, skillful survival. Hoelun kept her children alive not through fortune but through knowledge and will. And the children learned from her example what the steppe's most fundamental lesson had always been, that life on these plains was not given. It was taken carefully every single day. As the years of hardship continued, tension grew within the small family itself. Yasuge had taken more than one wife, as was customary among Mongol chieftains of standing. His secondary wife, Sochigal, had borne him 2 sons of her own, Behter and his younger brother, Belgutai. In the desperate, resource-scarce struggle that now defined daily life, Behter, as an older half-brother, began asserting dominance over the family's scarce provisions. He and Belgutai monopolized the food and small game that Temujin and his full brother Kasar managed to obtain through hunting and effort. The rivalry was not merely personal. It was about the question of who would lead what remained of this family, who would inherit whatever future could be built from these ruins. When Temujin was approximately 14 or 15 years old, he and Kassar ambushed Behter, while the older boy was alone, guarding the family's 9 horses. Temujin shot him from the front. Kassar struck him from behind. Behter was killed. The secret history records this moment without flinching, and historians have returned to it ever since, because it reveals something cold and decisive at the core of the young Temujin. A willingness to remove any obstacle to his authority, even one wrapped in the bonds of shared blood. The killing of Behter did not go unnoticed in the wider world of the steppe. Not long after, the Tayyichiut clan descended on Hoelun's small camp. The Tayyichiut were a rival Mongol clan who had seized control of the tribal leadership following Yesugei's death, driving the family out and treating them as disposable dependents. Now they saw in the growing Temujin not merely a fatherless boy, but a threat. A young man of Borjigin blood, old enough to hold a bow, possessed of a dangerous, undiminished spirit. Viewing him as a rival to their newly claimed authority, they captured him and fitted him with a wooden kang, a heavy, rigid collar and frame of wood placed around the neck and shoulders, forcing the arms through openings that made it impossible to use the hands freely. Such a device could weigh between 9 and 15 kilograms. It prevented sitting, lying down, and self-feeding. It was designed not only to immobilize the body, but to announce to everyone who saw the wearer that this person had been marked. Stripped of standing, reduced to the lowest condition a steppe person could occupy. For the son of Yesugei the Brave, the humiliation was as complete as it was deliberate. Temujin did not remain in that captivity. The means of his escape came through an unlikely source. A man named Sorkan Shira, a farmhand of the Suldus clan within the Tayyichiut. Sorkan Shira discovered the imprisoned youth hidden in a river backwater, and at considerable personal risk, concealed him from the searching guards, repeatedly redirecting their attention away. When the search parties finally dispersed, Sorkan Shira's sons, Chilaun and Chimbai, broke the wooden kang and burned it. Sorkan Shira's daughter, Kadan, tended to Temujin's recovery. The family provided food, shelter within a pile of wool bales, and eventually a horse that allowed him to slip away from the Tayyichiut entirely and find his way back to his mother's camp. This escape would not be forgotten. In the years to come, as Temujin's power grew, he would remember those who had shown mercy in the moments when mercy had cost something. Sorkan Shira and his family would eventually be rewarded, but in that immediate moment, what mattered most was simpler. The boy who the Tayyichiut had tried to reduce to nothing had walked back out of his captivity, battered, hungry, and free. The steppe had tried again, and again it had not finished him. By the time Temujin made his way back to his family, the outline of who he was becoming had already been drawn in suffering, in violence, and in survival. He had been born into privilege and cast into poverty before he was 10 years old. He had watched his mother scavenge roots from frozen riverbanks to keep her children breathing. He had killed a rival within his own family. He had worn the kanga of a prisoner and walked away from it. He had learned through every one of these encounters that the steppe rewarded not the most fortunate or the best born, but the most resilient, the one who could endure what others could not, and then keep moving. He carried with him still the promise of Borta, the betrothal arranged in his father's lifetime, the alliance with the Kongirad waiting to be claimed, and the sources that preserve his story, the secret history of the Mongols, the Persian chronicles of Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, the Chinese dynastic histories of the Yuan, all agree that these early years were not merely hardship endured. They were a man being made. But surviving the steppe as a boy was only the beginning, for Temujin would soon face a loss so devastating and a humiliation so complete that it would ignite within him a fury that no tribe, no kingdom, and no empire would ultimately be able to contain. Chapter 2. Forging the Great Khan. Long before the name Genghis Khan was known to the world, there was a young man named Temujin, and his story was already marked by loss, hardship, and a fierce, quiet determination. His mother, Hoelun, had been taken from her first husband, a Merkit nobleman named Chiledu, by Temujin's father, Yesugai, who seized her and made her his own wife. It was a wound the Merkit people carried silently for years, the memory of that old theft still alive in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. So when Temujin took a wife of his own, a woman named Borta, gentle and steadfast, the Merkits saw an opportunity for a vengeance long overdue. They came in the night, and they took her. The logic of the steppe was circular and ancient. What had been taken would be taken in return. Temujin awoke to an absence, a cold and devastating silence where his wife had been. The kidnapping of Borta was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a challenge to everything Temujin was trying to build. His name, his alliances, his future. And it demanded an answer. The young man who rode out to find her would not be the same man who returned. Temujin was not without allies. His father Yesuge had sworn a bond with a powerful chieftain, Togrul, the leader of the Keraite Confederation, known also as Wang Khan. The Anda Pact between the two men was not merely a political arrangement. It was a bond as close as blood, a sworn brotherhood that extended its obligations across generations. When Temujin came to Togrul with his crisis, the older man did not turn him away. He agreed to help, partly out of loyalty to the memory of Yesugai, and partly because aiding Temujin would strengthen his own position among the competing powers of the steppe. Also riding alongside them was Jamuka, Temujin's own sworn blood brother, his Anda from childhood, a man who had shared dreams and hardships with Temujin across the wild years of their youth. Together, the alliance moved swiftly. Roughly 8 months after Borta's abduction, the combined force swept into the Merkit-held territory along the Barkujin region, driving deep into the land where the 3 Merkit tribes had made their camp. The attack came at night, catching the Merkits as they fled south along the Selenge River. In the chaos and darkness, Temujin found Borta. The secret history of the Mongols records the reunion with quiet tenderness. A return, a restoration, a moment the narrative honors with genuine warmth. Borta returned, but she returned carrying a child, and that child would become one of history's most quietly debated figures. The son born after her captivity was named Joki, and from the very beginning, the shadow of uncertainty fell over his birth. Borta had been held by the Merkits for roughly 8 months, and some chroniclers, both ancient and later, raised the possibility that Jochi had been fathered not by Temujin, but by a Merkit man during her captivity. Temujin chose to recognize Joshi as his eldest son. He gave him command, he gave him territory, and he gave him a place among his heirs. But the question never fully disappeared. It lingered in the words of Joshi's brothers, particularly Chagatai, who was known to use rumors of Joshi's uncertain birth to undermine his standing. The friction this created was slow and persistent. When the time came for Temujin to name a successor, the eldest son was passed over. Ogedei, younger and unclouded by doubt, was designated as heir. Joshi and his father maintained a relationship that was, by most accounts, formal and strained. They were bound by recognition, but divided by something neither could quite name. Joshi died before his father, and the question of his birth passed quietly into history, unanswered. The bond between Temujin and Jamuka had once been one of the great friendships of the steppe world. As children and young men, they had roamed together, sworn the Anda oath that made them brothers closer than blood, shared the same fires, the same ambitions, the same vast Mongolian sky. But friendship is sometimes the first casualty of incompatible visions. As Temujin's power grew, the differences between the two men became impossible to ignore. Jamuka believed in the old order. He believed that power belonged to those of noble lineage, that the hierarchy of the steppe was as natural as the seasons, that a shepherd was a shepherd, and a chief was a chief, and the lines between them were not to be crossed. Temujin believed something quite different. He had seen too many capable men ignored because of their birth, and too many incompetent nobles elevated because of their bloodline. He built his coalition on loyalty, on courage, on proven ability, recruiting shepherds and hunters and elevating them to command if they earned it. The rift between these two philosophies was not merely personal. It was a clash between two entirely different ideas about what a society could be. Around 1187, near the Onon River, the tension finally broke into open war. The battle was called Dalen Balshut, and Jamuka won. The defeat at Dalen Balshut was sharp, but what followed in its aftermath may have mattered more than the battle itself. Jamuka, victorious, had captured a number of Temujin's followers. Rather than absorbing them or showing measured restraint, he ordered something cruel. Dozens of young captives boiled alive. The act was meant to demonstrate power. Instead, it demonstrated something else entirely. Across the steppe, those who had been weighing their options began to make a different calculation. A man who could do that to prisoners was not a man who could hold a nation together. Temujin, by contrast, had shown a different kind of leadership. When he defeated enemies, he absorbed their people rather than destroying them. He took the surviving members of rival tribes and folded them into his growing confederation, executing only the leaders who resisted and allowing everyone else to begin again under his banner. He arranged marriages across tribal lines to create bonds of loyalty. He broke his warriors into mixed units, tens, hundreds, thousands, deliberately separated from their old tribal groupings so that a man's loyalty belonged to Temujin and to his unit not to the tribe he had been born into. Slowly, steadily, a new kind of identity was being forged on the steppe. Not Merkit, not Keraite, not Tatar. Something larger, something that had never quite existed before. Among the tribes Temujin faced, the Tatars held a particular significance. They were the people who had poisoned his father, Yesugai, years before, and the memory of that act had never faded. When Temujin finally moved against the Tatars with enough strength to achieve a decisive victory, the outcome was systematic and deliberate. Every Tatar male was measured against the linchpin of a cartwheel. Those taller than that mark, those who had reached the age of bearing arms, those who could remember the old feuds and carry them forward, were killed. Those shorter, the young children who had not yet grown into their history, were spared and taken as slaves. The practice is documented in the secret history of the Mongols, that remarkable chronicle of Temujin's rise, and it speaks to the cold precision with which he approached the problem of permanent enemies. It was not wanton cruelty. It was strategy of a particular kind, the erasure of a generation's worth of grievance, so that the next generation would have no memory to avenge. The Tatars as a political force ceased to exist. Their women were absorbed. Their children were folded into Mongol families. Their name endured only as a word that would, in time, come to describe the Mongol people themselves across much of the Western world. As Temujin's confederation grew, so did the sophistication of the machine that held it together. The army he was building was unlike anything the steppe had produced before. At its foundation was a decimal system of breathtaking logical elegance. Every 10 men formed an arban led by their own commander. 10 arbans made a jagun of 100. 10 jaguns formed a mingan of 1,000. And 10 mingans came together to form a tumen. 10,000 warriors moving as a single organism, capable of being broken apart and reassembled as the situation demanded. The genius of this structure was not merely organizational. By mixing men of different tribal origins into the same units, the old loyalties dissolved. A man's identity became his unit, his commander, and his Khan. Beyond this, Temujin imposed a discipline around looting that changed the nature of battle itself. No soldier could claim plunder until the commanding general gave explicit permission. Violation meant death. The effect was profound. Armies that had previously dissolved into chaos at the moment of victory, every man running for the richest tent, instead held their formations, maintained their cohesion, and remained a weapon in the commander's hand until the battle was truly finished. The Mongol army was becoming something the world had not yet learned to recognize or resist. The intelligence that preceded the Mongol army was as important as the army itself. Long before the main force arrived at any destination, an intricate network of scouts was already at work. These riders extended outward from the advancing column in a continuous screen, operating roughly 2 days ahead, sometimes covering as much as 240 kilometers in front of the main force. They mapped terrain, assessed enemy positions, counted livestock, noted water sources, and reported back through a chain of command that reached all the way to the commanding general's staff. The system was not improvised. It was hierarchical and deliberate, with a central staff officer responsible for coordinating what might be called the far and near eyes of the army, while each large division maintained its own complement of scouts. The result was that Temujin rarely fought blind. He entered engagements with an understanding of the ground and the enemy that his opponents almost never possessed in return. This intelligence advantage, combined with the decimal structure of his forces and the iron discipline he maintained, gave the Mongol army a quality of coordinated lethality that could execute complex maneuvers, feigned retreats, double encirclements, converging columns, with a reliability that left opponents struggling to understand what had just happened to them. The final rivals fell one after another in the years leading toward Temujin's great consolidation. Togrul, once his patron and ally, the man who had helped rescue Borta, turned against him in the end. The rupture came when Togrul refused to give his daughter in marriage to Temujin's eldest son, Joki, a refusal that carried a specific and unmistakable insult in Mongol custom. Togrul had also drawn closer to Jamuka, who remained an implacable rival. Temujin responded decisively. He exploited the defections already occurring within the Keraite Confederation. Many of Togrul's own men had begun to drift toward Temujin's banner, and launched an assault that shattered the Keraite army. Togrul fled. He was eventually caught by his own former followers and killed, and the Keraites dissolved as a political entity. Next came the Naimans, a formidable Western confederation that outnumbered the Mongols, possessed strong cavalry, and had long dominated the steppes beyond the Keraite border. They were, by any measure, a serious power. But Temujin's forces had by now developed an adaptability, a discipline, and a coordination that numerical advantage alone could not answer. The Naimans broke, and with them, Jamuka's last meaningful source of external support crumbled as well. Jamuka did not escape. After his final defeat, he was captured, not by Temujin himself, but by followers who turned him over, perhaps hoping for reward. Temujin interrogated him, and in a moment that the sources preserve with quiet poignancy, he offered his old blood brother a chance to live, a chance to serve, a chance to continue as something other than an enemy. Jamuka refused. Whatever else he was a man who understood the terms of his own life and would not accept them altered beyond recognition. He asked for an honorable death, and Temujin, who had once sworn brotherhood with this man, who had once shared fires and laughter and the enormous open sky with him, granted the request. Jamuka was executed without the shedding of blood, a strangulation or similar method that preserved the dignity his noble status demanded. The death of Jamuka closed a chapter that had stretched across decades. It also closed the last significant opposition on the Mongolian steppe. Meanwhile, at Temujin's court, another kind of power had been quietly at work. Shamanism was woven into every layer of Mongol life, and the court's most influential shaman, a man called Teb Tengri, had risen to extraordinary influence, claiming the favor of Tengri, the sky god, and using that claim to shape both spiritual and political decisions. He would eventually overreach, attempt to install a rival, and be killed, his back broken in a staged wrestling match. In the spring of 1206, at the source of the Onon River, all of these long years of struggle converged into a single, extraordinary moment. The Mongol chiefs assembled in their thousands for a grand Kurultai, a great gathering of the tribes. The heads of the Keraites, Naimans, Merkits, Tatars, and allied clans came together in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Even women were present, though the formal vote belonged to the chiefs. A white banner with 9 tails was raised against the sky. A shaman spoke blessings in the ancient tongue, invoking Tengri, the eternal sky. And Temujin, the boy who had been left for dead on the steppe, who had lost his father to poison and his wife to raiders, who had been defeated and had returned, who had chosen merit over blood and loyalty over lineage, was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title carried weight beyond any simple translation. Some scholars hear in it the Turkic word for ocean. Master of the ocean, ruler of all beneath the sky. He announced his laws, the Great Yasa, a code that applied equally to noble and commoner, that protected merchants and travelers, that bound soldiers together in collective responsibility. An empire was being born in the wind and grass, unhurried and immense. And with the steppe united beneath a single banner for the first time in generations, Genghis Khan turned his eyes southward and eastward toward the great walled civilizations that had long looked down upon the horse peoples of the north, never imagining that their walls might not be enough. Chapter 3. The World Cracks Open. Long before the great storms of conquest swept westward across the known world, there was a kingdom nestled quietly at the eastern edge of the Silk Road. The Xia, the Tangut people, had ruled their western Xia domain since 1038, a Buddhist civilization of Tibetan-speaking scholars, merchants, and craftsmen, settled in the fertile corridors of what is now the northwestern reaches of China. Their lands stretched across the provinces of Gansu and Shanxi, and the southern fringe of Inner Mongolia, a territory shaped by oasis trade routes and the slow, patient exchange of goods between Central Asia and the great Chinese heartland. The Xia sat at the eastern terminus of the Silk Road like a quiet tollkeeper, growing wealthy on taxes and commerce, sheltered behind the mountains and the desert. For Genghis Khan, this kingdom was not merely a prize to be taken, it was a necessity. Subduing the Xia meant securing the Silk Road's wealth, drawing skilled craftsmen and engineers into Mongol service, and eliminating any threat from the rear before the great armies turned southward toward the richer prizes of the Jin and Song dynasties. The world was being arranged, quietly and deliberately, into something new. Yet the road to conquest was not always swift or certain. The Mongol army, peerless on open steppe and vast grassland, encountered a different world when it met the silence of stone walls rising high above the dust. Walled cities were fortresses unto themselves, and the Mongols, whose genius lay in mobility and the devastating swarm of mounted archers, found themselves humbled before locked gates and towering ramparts. Early assaults on fortified towns such as Volohai ended in costly failure. Soldiers attempted to scale the walls with ladders and were driven back with heavy losses. Similar setbacks unfolded at Nangkuo Pass and at the Xia capital of Zhongxing, where the Mongol forces, unfamiliar with the patient art of siege, were forced to improvise in desperate and sometimes bizarre ways. There are accounts of demands made for unusual tribute, cats and swallows, followed by fire and smoke used to breach the city's defenses. These were the rough experiments of an army learning a new kind of warfare. The Mongols could have remained a steppe power, cycling endlessly through open battles on familiar ground. Instead, they chose to adapt. And that decision, slow, deliberate, born from failure, would change the architecture of the world. Failure, for the Mongols, was a teacher. From their early stumbles against walled cities, they began a systematic transformation of their military capabilities. Captured Chinese engineers, specialists from the Song and Jin dynasties, were brought into the army not as prisoners, but as craftsmen of war. These men traveled with the Mongol forces, building and operating sophisticated siege machines wherever a fortified target was encountered. Traction trebuchets gave way to the heavier counterweight designs. Mangonel-type catapults, massive crossbows, and towering siege towers were assembled and disassembled on the march, mounted on wagons or carried on the backs of animals across great distances. Alongside these engines came something darker and more wondrous: the early weapons of gunpowder. Incendiary bombs, firepots, and thundercrash bombs were hurled over city walls, filling the air with smoke, fire, and terrifying sound. Underground, engineers dug mining tunnels and sapping operations, diverting rivers and building earthwork dams to flood or undermine the foundations of enemy fortifications. What had once been a weakness became, through patience and borrowed knowledge, one of the Mongols' most formidable strengths. They had learned to be patient. They had learned to build. And with that knowledge, no wall in the world was safe. While the Mongols refined their siegecraft in the east, a different kind of power held sway over the north of China. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, founded in 1115 by the Wanyan clan, had risen from the forests of Manchuria to become the masters of northern China, their golden empire stretching from Manchuria down through the Great Plains to what is now Beijing. They had humbled the Khitan Liao and stripped the Song dynasty of its northern heartland. Their capital had moved south over the decades, from Shangjing near modern Harbin to the city of Yanjing, the place the world would one day call Beijing, in 1153. By the early 13th century, the Jin state still commanded enormous territory, but the foundations were quietly cracking. Heavy tribute payments flowed to the southern Song. Internal factionalism festered within the court. Fiscal pressures mounted year by year. And at the northern edge of the empire's consciousness, across the steppes and deserts, a new kind of storm was gathering. The Jin could see it coming, but could not fully believe it. They had endured for over a century. They had conquered empires of their own. Whatever threat this northern warlord posed, surely the golden walls of Zhongdu would hold. Surely the world they had built was permanent. It was not. The war between the Mongols and the Jin unfolded in great, patient waves. In 1211, Mongol forces shattered the Jin's Great Wall defences at Wushabao and drove through the border fortresses with overwhelming force. At the mountain pass of Yehuling, near present-day Zhangjiakou, the Jin army was broken in a decisive engagement. The retreating soldiers were massacred at Hauihebo. The eastern capital, Liaoyang, fell to the swift raiding columns of the general Jebe. By 1214, the pressure on Zhongdu itself had become unbearable. Genghis Khan's main army besieged the great capital, and the Jin emperor, confronted with the reality of collapse, made the fateful decision to abandon Zhongdu and move the court southward. The city, the cultural and political heart of the Jurchen Empire, was left to its fate. On the 31st of May 1215, Zhongdu fell to the Mongols. What followed was the destruction of a world. Massacre and fire swept through the city. The Jin emperor fled to the southern capital at Kaifeng. The site that had been the golden throne of an empire would eventually be rebuilt, renamed Dadu, and transformed into the foundation of a new order under Mongol rule. A city that would one day become Beijing. But in 1215 it was only ruin and silence. Even as the Jin collapsed in the east, the gaze of the Great Khan turned westward toward a different world entirely. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, was one of the most powerful states of the early 13th century. Its territory stretched from the Caspian coast of Shirvan across the heartland of Transoxania and Khorasan all the way to the Indus River, encompassing the Persian world, much of modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Great cities rose from this landscape. Samarkand with its shimmering domes, Bukhara with its libraries and minarets, Gurganj with its teeming markets. At its height, the Shah could call upon a standing force estimated at 400,000 troops, a number that dwarfed most armies of the age. Yet beneath this grandeur lay fragile foundations. The Shah ruled as an autocrat, distrusted by many of his commanders, reliant on semi-independent Kipchak nomadic warriors whose loyalty was uncertain. Internal dissent simmered through the empire's veins. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a great trade caravan to the Khwarezmian frontier, not as a threat, but as an overture, an offer of commerce and peaceful exchange along the Silk Road. What happened next would set the ancient world on fire. The story of how peace became catastrophe can be told in a single decision made at the city of Otrar. When the Mongol trade caravan arrived at this frontier outpost in 1218, the governor, a man known as Inalchuk, seized the merchants' goods and accused the entire party of being Mongol spies. He brought his suspicions to Shah Muhammad II, and the Shah, rather than seeking careful judgment, ordered the caravan's members executed. The governor complied. When word reached Genghis Khan, he sent envoys to the Khwarezmian court demanding justice, that the governor be punished and the seized goods returned. The Shah's response was not negotiation. He had the chief envoy beheaded. The remaining two messengers were humiliated, their beards shaved, and sent back across the desert bearing nothing but insult. In the political language of the steppe, there could be no greater provocation. The Khan had extended a hand, and it had been struck away. He began to mobilize his forces, not in anger, or at least not only in anger, but with the cold, methodical certainty of a man who understood exactly what was about to happen. The Khwarezmian Empire had been offered an opening to commerce. Instead, it had chosen a confrontation with a force that had already shattered kingdoms. The Mongol force that assembled for the Khwarezmian campaign was not the largest army ever raised, but it was perhaps the most precisely designed. Most modern scholars estimate the total force at somewhere between 70 and 100,000 soldiers, with a reasonable figure near 75,000. Overwhelmingly cavalry, The army was built around highly mobile mounted archers, supplemented by smaller contingents of infantry and the specialized siege engineers now woven deep into the Mongol system. Against them, the Shah could theoretically field 400,000 troops. Yet numbers in this war would mean very little. The Shah made a decision that would doom his empire. Rather than gathering his immense army into a single concentrated field force, he scattered it as garrisons throughout the walled cities of his realm. This choice was driven by distrust of his own commanders, by a belief that the cordon of fortified towns would halt the Mongol advance, and perhaps by a certain pride in the solidity of his cities. The Mongols responded with a strategy of simultaneous columns, multiple independent armies advancing on different axes at the same moment. While some forces fixed the Shah's troops along the Syr Darya riverline, others swept through the desert to flank from the north and south, striking deep behind the defensive cordon. The Shah's 400,000 soldiers could not concentrate because they were already surrounded. City after city fell. Bukhara, the great seat of Islamic scholarship in Central Asia, surrendered after a brief siege in 1220. When Genghis Khan entered the city's Friday mosque and gathered its wealthiest citizens, he is recorded as having addressed them with words that have echoed through history, that he was the punishment of God sent upon them because of their own great sins. Whether those words were spoken exactly as recorded or refined by later chroniclers, they reveal something important about how the Mongols understood and weaponized their own ferocity. After the declaration, the city was stripped of its wealth. Wooden structures and the mosque itself were burned. Artisans were deported to Mongolia. Men of fighting age were conscripted into the army. Others were sold into slavery. The vast library, tens of thousands of books gathered over centuries, was destroyed. Samarkand followed, then Urgench, then Merv. Islamic historians recorded the scale of destruction in terms that still carry a kind of dazed horror. Ibn al-Athir described streets running with blood, and the great libraries of Bukhara reduced to ash. Juvaini wrote of Nishapur's walls torn down, its river turned black. Rashid al-Din recorded Samarkand's great citadel collapsing, its towers shattered, the sound of mourning echoing across the plain. Whatever the exact numbers, and scholars treat the chronicler's figures as symbolic of catastrophe rather than literal counts, the destruction of Central Asian urban civilization was real, vast, and deliberate. The Shah himself did not die in battle. After the fall of his capital, he fled westward, a hunted man pursued across a vast territory by two of the most gifted generals in Mongol service, Jebi and Subutai. Jebi, known as the Arrow, had once been an enemy of Genghis Khan before earning his trust through courage and extraordinary horsemanship. Subutai, the son of a blacksmith, had joined Temujin's forces as a young man and risen by sheer skill to become the premier Mongol strategist of his age. Together they rode not simply to catch a fleeing emperor, but to see and learn, to map the Western world for future conquest. They pursued the Shah through Persia, into Azerbaijan, across Georgia and the rugged Caucasus Mountains, and onward into the open steppe north of the Caspian Sea. Muhammad II, once master of an empire that stretched from the Caspian to the Indus, fled with a diminishing retinue until even the sea offered no safety. He died in December 1220 on a remote island in the Caspian, most likely of pneumonia, the shock of total loss having consumed what illness alone might not. His empire dissolved like a dream at the edge of waking, and Jebe and Subutai rode on. The great reconnaissance of Jebe and Subutai did not end with the Shah's death. It became something far larger, one of the most extraordinary journeys of the medieval world. From the Caspian shore, they swept northward into Azerbaijan, crossed into Georgia, forced through the Caucasus Mountains, and emerged on the steppe north of the Black Sea, riding through the lands of the Alans, the Circassians, and the Kipchak-Cuman Confederation. On the 31st of May 1223, at the banks of the Kalka River, in what is now eastern Ukraine, their forces met a combined army of Rus princes and Cuman warriors. Using the feigned retreat, the Mongols' most reliable and devastating tactical deception, they lured the allied force into a reckless pursuit, then turned their cavalry to encircle and annihilate it. The Rus princes were slain or captured, the Cumans scattered. The battle lasted moments in the scale of history, but its intelligence value would last for decades. The western lands were fragmented. The Russian principalities did not cooperate. The steppe routes were mapped. The rivers were known. The weaknesses had been found. Jebe and Subutai withdrew eastward, carrying everything they had learned. The world that lay between the Mongol heartland and the Atlantic coast of Europe had been measured and judged. And so the chapter of expansion drew its breath, gathering toward what was yet to come. Even as his armies rewrote the map of the known world, the man at the center of this vast transformation remained a figure of deep complexity and private contradiction. And the mystery surrounding his final days and hidden resting place would become one of history's most enduring and deliberately kept secrets. Chapter 4. The Death That Could Not Be Found. In the final years of his life, Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward across the dry plateaus, and then back again to an older wound that had never fully healed. The Western Jia, a Tangut kingdom nestled along the great bend of the Yellow River, had for years paid tribute to the Mongol throne and supplied soldiers for its campaigns. But when Genghis marched against the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, the Western Shia refused to send the aid they had promised. Worse still, they began quietly reaching toward the Jin and Song dynasties, ancient enemies of the Mongols, seeking an alliance that would have encircled the growing empire from the east. For Genghis Khan, this was not merely a political inconvenience. It was betrayal. And betrayal, in the world he had built, carried only one answer. By 1225, a massive punitive expedition was set in motion. Key towns fell one by one: Haisui, Ganzhou, Suzhou, Shiliangfu. The capital, Yinchuan, was placed under siege. The campaign was thorough, deliberate, and deeply personal. It was to be his last. The campaign against the Western Shia was, by all accounts, proceeding toward its conclusion when something unexpected occurred. Genghis Khan, who had spent a lifetime on horseback, suffered a fall during a hunt. The chronicles describe him slipping from his mount, striking the earth with the force of a man who had ridden for 6 decades. He lingered afterward, weakened but still directing the final stages of the war. The capital Yinchuan eventually fell. Emperor Moju was executed. The cities and countryside were razed. The culture of the Western Xia scattered like ash on the wind. But Genghis Khan himself did not live to complete the return journey. He died in August of 1227, somewhere in the field. The Secret History of the Mongols, the earliest surviving literary record of the Mongol people, notes the year of his death without elaboration. It does not say how he died. It does not say where he was buried. That silence, deliberate and absolute, would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. A man who had shaped the world left it without a single clear account of his final breath. History has never settled on a single explanation for how Genghis Khan died, and the accounts that survive are varied enough to suggest that even those who were present were uncertain or unwilling to speak plainly. The most widely accepted version, drawn from early Mongol chronicles, holds that the fall from his horse during the hunt was the beginning of the end. Internal injuries that a man in his 60s could not overcome, worsened perhaps by the unrelenting demands of the campaign. Chinese records add the possibility of fever or malaria taking hold in the weeks that followed. Persian accounts speak of a sudden, fatal illness, perhaps a typhus-like epidemic that swept through the army. Some Mongolian sources suggest an arrow wound to the leg that became infected. A Franciscan traveler, writing from a distance of both miles and years, recorded that the Great Khan had been struck by lightning. And then there are the stranger stories of witchcraft, of dark intentions, of a captive concubine from the defeated Western Xia. Each account tells something different. Together they tell only that no one truly knew, or that those who did know chose to say nothing. The mystery was not accidental. It was, in some sense, a final act of power. Among the many competing accounts, the story of a Xia captive woman has captured the imagination of later storytellers more than almost any other. In some versions, a royal woman from the fallen Tangut court was taken by the conquering forces, her status stripped, her fate uncertain. The tale describes humiliation, loss, and an act of violence or desperation directed at the conquering Khan himself. It is a vivid story. It is also, according to modern scholars, almost certainly a later embellishment. The dramatic details are absent from contemporaneous Western Xia, Song, or Yuan chronicles. The account surfaces only in literary and polemical sources, written long after the events they describe, shaped as much by the need to explain as by any desire to record. Medieval peoples who fell beneath the Mongol shadow often constructed narratives of unmitigated savagery and narratives of justice done to the conqueror. Such stories served a purpose. They transformed bewildering defeat into something comprehensible. They gave meaning to catastrophe. In doing so, they blurred the line between memory and myth, leaving historians to sift through layers of grief and legend to find whatever truth might lie beneath. Whatever the cause of death, what followed was shaped by the deepest traditions of Mongol funerary practice. For the nomadic peoples of the steppe, burial was a sacred and private act. The body of the deceased would be laid out within a yurt, where relatives performed rites of purification and offered food and drink. Prayers were recited. The spirit was honored. For great leaders, the journey continued far beyond the encampment. Elite Khans were conveyed over long distances to sacred, concealed locations, traditionally in the Altai region or at a mountain of spiritual significance, where their tombs were hidden in remote valleys, guarded and sealed against the world. No marker was left. No monument rose to announce the place. The secrecy was intentional and absolute. A Mongol grave was not meant to be found. It was meant to disappear back into the earth from which the rider had come, leaving nothing for enemies to desecrate, nothing for the curious to disturb. In this tradition, concealment was not an absence of reverence. It was the fullest expression of it. The land itself became the tomb, and the tomb became indistinguishable from the land. The funeral procession that carried Genghis Khan's body back toward Mongolia became, in the accounts that survived, something vast and deliberate. Mongol chronicles describe a massive escort, a great army of mourners moving in silence across the steppe. Along the route, it is said, those who encountered the procession were killed so that the path of the body would remain unknown. 1,000 horses were ridden across the burial site to erase every trace of disturbed earth. Some accounts speak of a river being diverted over the grave. Others describe trees being planted, the permafrost of the north allowed to close over the location like a wound healing. The Erdeni Topçi and the Altan Topçi, Mongol chronicles written in the 17th century, offer varying details. An empty sarcophagus, a symbolic burial, only his shirt, tent, and boots interred in one place while the body lay elsewhere. Marco Polo, writing from the court of Kublai Khan, records the custom of carrying great Khans to a lofty Altai peak, noting the extreme measures taken to preserve their secrecy. The secret history of the Mongols notes the year of death and says nothing more. Together, these accounts paint a picture not of forgetting, but of the most thorough concealment ever undertaken. For centuries, the question of where Genghis Khan was buried remained unanswered, guarded not only by the concealment carried out at the time of his death, but by a living tradition of protection. The Khentii region in northeastern Mongolia, encompassing the Khentai Mountains, the sacred peak of Burkhan Khaldun, and the protected wilderness zone known as the Ich Korig, the Great Taboo, had been the ancestral land of the Borjigin clan for generations. Burkhan Khaldun was the mountain Genghis Khan had fled to as a young man, seeking refuge from enemies in its forested slopes. It was the place he had pledged to return to in death. For 800 years, a strict prohibition kept the area sealed against outsiders. No one entered, no one searched. The land held its silence, enforced first by warriors, then by tradition, and finally by the simple vastness of the wilderness itself. Modern non-invasive surveys have identified a large human-made tumulus on Burkhan Khaldun and nearby walled burial grounds that match the descriptions in historical sources of a royal tomb. The Khentii region remains, for scholars today, the most likely location of the hidden grave, though likely is a word that carries enormous uncertainty. In the modern era, the search for Genghis Khan's burial site has drawn scholars, archaeologists, and historians from around the world. Satellite remote sensing technology has been turned toward the remote landscapes of Mongolia, scanning terrain for traces of disturbed earth, buried structures, and the subtle signatures left by ancient construction. These surveys have identified what appear to be walled burial grounds and a significant tumulus near Burkhan Khaldun, details that align with the fragmentary descriptions preserved in Mongol chronicles. Yet, the physical evidence remains indirect. No tomb has been opened. No confirmed burial chamber has been excavated. The Mongolian government has maintained protections over the Ich-Korig region out of respect for the traditions surrounding it, and many Mongolian scholars and citizens believe the site should remain undisturbed regardless of what it might contain. There is something quietly profound in that position. The idea that some knowledge should remain buried, that the concealment Genghis Khan ordered has become, across 8 centuries, a kind of inheritance. The man who left no monument has nonetheless left the most enduring mystery in the history of the steppe, and perhaps the most carefully protected grave in the world. The earliest surviving literary work in the Mongolian language is also, in many ways, the most intimate record of the man behind the empire. The secret history of the Mongols was composed shortly after Genghis Khan's death, most likely in 1228 or 1229, written in Middle Mongolian using the old Uyghur-derived Mongolian vertical script. Its author is unknown. It was not intended for outsiders. It was a private document, the record of a people telling their own story to themselves. Within its passages, Genghis Khan is not simply a conqueror. He mourns. He laughs. He grieves. He thanks his night guards for keeping him at peace and allowing him to attain the throne of joy. He speaks of his father's death with tears. He describes the loss of Borta, his first wife, in words that carry the register of genuine sorrow. He jokes about his soldiers, watching a mock battle and remarking with dry affection that they had outflanked the enemy like a flock of sheep outpacing a herd of goats. The secret history was lost to outsiders for centuries, surfacing only in 1866, when a Russian monk and sinologist, Archimandrit Palladius, discovered an abridged Chinese translation of the text in a Ming-era archive in Beijing. From that discovery, generations of scholars across Russia, Japan, France, Germany, and the English-speaking world worked to reconstruct and translate the original. The secret history of the Mongols was rediscovered not as a complete original manuscript, but as a Chinese transliteration, a phonetic rendering of Mongolian sounds into Chinese characters preserved during the Ming dynasty. Archimandrit Palladius recognized its significance immediately and produced the first modern translation into Russian. Over the following century and a half, scholars built upon that foundation with painstaking care. Naka Michio published a Japanese translation in 1907. Erich Hennisch produced a German scholarly reconstruction in 1937. Sergei Kozin offered a separate Russian translation in 1941. Paul Pelliot worked toward a full reconstruction in the same era. The first complete English translation from the original Mongolian was produced by Francis Woodman Cleaves in 1982. And Igor de Rashovilts later refined the scholarship in a multi-volume edition that has become the standard reference. Each of these translations brought something different to the text, a different cultural lens, a different set of assumptions, a different relationship to the silences the original leaves behind. Together, they have made The Secret History one of the most thoroughly studied medieval documents in the world, a record of a civilization that preferred to keep its truths hidden, and yet, through the slow work of scholars across nations, has gradually allowed those truths to surface. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, somewhere in the field far from the sacred mountain he had pledged to return to. His body was carried home across the steppe by an army of mourners who left nothing behind to mark the road they had travelled. The earth closed over his grave. The forests grew. The permafrost held its silence. 8 centuries later, the location of his burial remains one of the great unanswered questions of the ancient world. A mystery preserved as much by intention as by time. What survives is not a tomb but a story told in fragments. In the careful, imperfect pages of The Secret History, in the contradictory accounts of Persian and Chinese chroniclers, in the traditions of the Mongolian people who have guarded the wilderness of the Ich-Korig through generations, without being asked to explain why. Genghis Khan built an empire that stretched across the known world, and then he disappeared from it as completely as any man in history ever has. The empire itself, however, did not disappear with him. Yet the empire Genghis Khan had built was only the beginning of the story, for his sons and grandsons would carry the Mongol banner further than even he had imagined, reaching the gates of Western Europe, extinguishing the oldest caliphate in Islam, and finally meeting their match in the sands of a distant Egyptian valley. Chapter 5. The Empire at the Edge of the World. After the death of Genghis Khan, the vast empire he had shaped from the open steppe did not pass quietly to a single heir. Instead, the Mongol world paused in a long, uncertain breath. For 2 years, his youngest son, Tolui, served as regent, holding together a fragile stillness while the great princes gathered their thoughts and their ambitions. Then, in 1229, the assembly known as the Kurultai was called. The Kurultai was more than a meeting. It was the living heart of Mongol political life, a gathering of senior princes, military commanders, and allied tribal leaders who would together choose the next great Khan. Succession was never automatic. It required consensus, negotiation, and the careful distribution of loyalty. At this Kurultai, the assembly confirmed Genghis Khan's own nomination. His third son, Ögedei, would take the throne. Yet the meeting was far from peaceful. Tolui, who had proven himself a capable battlefield commander, had his own supporters pressing for his elevation. Chagatai, another son, harbored his own reservations. And from the western reaches came the voice of Batu, grandson of Genghis, representing the Joshid line and its territorial ambitions. Through careful compromise, the assembly found its balance. Tolui relinquished his claim in exchange for stewardship of the central heartland. Ögedei promised to share the wealth of conquered Chinese lands with his brothers. A fragile unity held, and the empire moved forward once more. Ögedei Khan was a man shaped by both inheritance and temperament. Born around 1186, the third son of Genghis Khan grew into a ruler who understood that conquest alone could not sustain an empire of such immense proportions. He was pragmatic and charismatic, capable of inspiring loyalty while delegating authority to able commanders without losing his grip on the wider whole. His achievements were considerable. He founded the permanent Mongol capital at Karakorum, giving the empire its first true administrative center, a city of merchants and diplomats, of translators and tax collectors, rising slowly from the steppe. He instituted a unified system of governance and taxation that began to integrate the conquered lands into something resembling a coherent state. He extended the Yam postal network, a vast relay system of horse riders and stations that carried messages across thousands of kilometers with remarkable speed. Under his direction, campaigns pushed deeper into Central Asia, Persia, and the edges of Eastern Europe. The Jin dynasty of northern China, long besieged and worn by Mongol pressure, finally fell during his reign. And yet, Ogedei's failures were also real. The Japanese islands repelled Mongol fleets with storms. The southern Song dynasty of southern China held firm. And beneath the surface of his court, the tensions of succession and resource strain were already beginning their slow, quiet work. For now, though, the empire remained whole, and Ogedei remained at its center. Among all the unfinished campaigns Genghis Khan had left behind, the destruction of the Jin dynasty of northern China stood as one of the most pressing. The war had begun in 1211, grinding on through decades of siege and counterattack. By the time Ogedei Khan launched his decisive renewed invasion in 1232, the Jin were already weakened and encircled. In a strategic alliance that speaks to the complex political calculations of the age, Ogedei joined forces with the southern Song dynasty, the Jin's bitter rival to the south. Together, their armies pressed down upon the remaining Jin strongholds with overwhelming pressure. The Jin capital of Kaifeng fell to Mongol forces in 1233. The last emperor, Aizong, fled southward, seeking refuge in the fortified city of Kaizhou. But there was no true refuge left. A combined Song and Mongol army surrounded the city and laid siege, tightening like a slow, patient hand. In early 1234, rather than face capture, Emperor Aizong took his own life. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, was extinguished. The Mongols and their Song allies divided the former Jin territories between them, though that partnership, too, would not endure the years ahead. The fall of the Jin was a turning point. It freed Mongol resources and attention, and pointed their vast armies toward horizons even further west. With northern China subdued, Mongol eyes turned westward, toward the vast patchwork of Rus principalities, the plains of Poland, and the kingdoms beyond. Leading this great western campaign was Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis through his father Joshi, a man who had inherited the westernmost territories of the empire and ruled them as his own Ulus. At Batu's side stood Subutai, perhaps the most gifted military mind the Mongol world ever produced. Born around 1175, Subutai had served as chief general and principal strategist to Genghis himself, and later to Ogedei. He had directed more than 20 major campaigns across China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Russian steppe. He had never lost a pitched battle. The empire's expansion into new and distant lands was, in many ways, the work of his extraordinary tactical imagination. The Great Western Campaign of 1236 was the culmination of years of preparation. Subutai devised a three-pronged advance, designed to strike multiple kingdoms simultaneously, preventing any coordinated European defense. One army would drive into Poland, a second would cross the Carpathian Mountains into Hungary, a third would sweep through Moravia, Dalmatia, and parts of Serbia, securing the western flank. It was a strategy of breathtaking scale. Hundreds of kilometers of synchronized movement across frozen rivers and mountain passes, timed to unfold almost simultaneously. The world to the west had no idea what was coming. Before the Mongol armies could reach Poland or Hungary, they first swept through the fragmented principalities of the Rus lands, a collection of rival city-states that had never managed to unite against the approaching storm. In 1237, Ryazan was the first to fall. The city was sacked and destroyed, its people scattered or killed. Vladimir followed in 1238, along with the surrounding Suzdal region, razed by Mongol forces moving with terrifying efficiency. Yaroslavl, Pereyaslavl, Chernigov, one by one, the great cities of the Rus crumbled under the Mongol advance. A last attempt at organized resistance came at the Sit River in March 1238. Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir had mustered what forces he could, roughly 3,000 men, hoping to relieve his fallen capital. The Mongol commander Burundai brought at least 10,000 cavalry to the field. The Rus force was surrounded and annihilated. Yuri II died in the battle. Organized resistance across the Rus lands effectively ended. Then, in the autumn of 1240, Batu Khan's forces turned toward Kiev, the ancient heart of Rus civilization. After a brief but devastating siege, the city's walls were breached. The population, estimated at perhaps 50,000 before the assault, was reduced to barely 2,000 survivors. The traveller Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, passing through years later, recorded streets still lined with skulls and bones. Kiev would not fully recover for generations. With the Rus principalities shattered behind them, the Mongol armies swept westward into the very heart of medieval Europe. Subutai's three-pronged plan unfolded with precise, almost dreamlike coordination. In April 1241, the northern arm of the Mongol advance, led by the princes Kadan and Baidar, engaged a coalition of European forces near Legnica in Silesia. Duke Henry II the Pious commanded a force of Polish knights, Moravian troops, and crusading orders. Teutonic knights, Hospitallers, and Templars among them. On the 9th of April, the Mongols won decisively. Henry II was killed, his forces scattered across the frost-hardened fields of Silesia. Just 2 days later, and hundreds of kilometers to the south, the main Mongol army under Batu and Subutai met the Hungarian royal forces at the Sajo River near the village of Mohi. King Bela IV commanded a formidable host. It was not enough. The Mongols encircled the Hungarian camp under cover of night, struck at dawn with a barrage of projectiles and fire, and then channeled the panicking Hungarians through a deliberately opened gap, only to cut them down as they fled. The Hungarian army was annihilated. Bela IV escaped on horseback, pursued for days across his own broken kingdom. Buda and Pest were sacked. The Mongols marched down the Danube, reaching as far as Wiener Neustadt in Austria, the very edge of the Holy Roman Empire's eastern border. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol armies stood at the threshold of Western Europe. Subutai had already drawn up plans for further campaigns against the Holy Roman Empire, then France, Italy, and Spain. Reconnaissance missions had sent spies deep into eastern Austria. Contemporary chronicles noted that he had mapped out the next phase with the same meticulous care that had brought him to the banks of the Danube. And then, in the winter that followed, a single piece of news arrived from the distant Mongol heartland. Genghis Khan had died on the 11th of December, 1241, most likely from a stroke or organ failure, his body weakened by years of heavy drinking. Rumors of poisoning also circulated, as they always do when powerful men fall unexpectedly. But the cause mattered less than the consequence. Batu Khan and Subutai received the news through the Yam courier network. Riders carrying the word westward with all the speed the relay stations allowed. The message was unambiguous in its implications. The Great Khan was dead. The imperial succession was open, and every prince of the blood was expected to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would choose the next ruler. By early 1242, the Mongol armies began their long withdrawal from the Danube. Vienna would not be sacked. Western Europe would not be conquered. The empire, for a moment, turned inward, and history quietly pivoted on that single, unexpected death. The years following Ogedei's death were marked by uncertainty and political maneuvering within the Mongol imperial family. A new Great Khan would eventually emerge from that long struggle. Mongke Khan, a grandson of Genghis through his father Tolui, who came to power following a decisive Kurultai in 1251. Mongke's rise was engineered with care. His mother, the remarkable Sorghagtani Beki, had spent years cultivating alliances, most importantly with Batu of the Golden Horde, whose support proved decisive. Once Mongke secured the throne, he moved swiftly to consolidate it, ordering a purge of rival Ogedeid claimants and executing the former regent, Ogul Kayemish. As Great Khan, Mongke proved to be a capable administrator. He ordered a comprehensive census of the empire's populations. He standardized taxation and tribute systems. He introduced coinage and paper money across the realm. And he set in motion the campaigns that would define his reign, delegating his brother Kublai to press the war against the Song dynasty in southern China, and entrusting another brother, Hulagu, with a mandate to extend Mongol power deep into the Islamic West. The empire under Mongke was still vast, still formidable, still moving outward. But it was also becoming something more complex than Genghis Khan had built. A collection of semi-autonomous realms, each shaped by the character of the prince who held it, each carrying its own momentum into the years ahead. Hulagu Khan, son of Tolui and grandson of Genghis, received his mandate from Mongke around 1255. He was to march into southwest Asia with a fifth of the Mongol forces, eliminate the Nizari Ismaili strongholds, the notorious assassins of their mountain fortresses, and then compel the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad to submit. If the Caliph refused, he was to be destroyed. The Abbasid Caliphate, at this moment, carried a weight far beyond its political power. For centuries, it had stood as the spiritual center of the Sunni Muslim world. The Caliph described as the shadow of God on earth, his lineage traced back to Abbas, uncle of the Prophet. In practice, Real political authority had long passed to foreign dynasties like the Seljuks, leaving the caliph as a revered figurehead. But the symbolic significance of that office was immense. The siege of Baghdad began on the 29th of January, 1258. Hulagu commanded a force of more than 130,000 men, equipped with siege engines capable of reducing ancient walls to rubble. The eastern fortifications fell within days. By the 4th of February, Mongol forces held the eastern wall. The Caliph al-Mustasim sent envoys and offered terms repeatedly. The Mongols killed his messengers and rejected every negotiation. On the 10th of February, the Caliph surrendered. What followed lasted 3 days, a sack of the greatest city in the Islamic world. The sack of Baghdad lasted until an amnesty was declared on the 20th of February, 1258. Estimates of the dead reached as high as 200,000. The city's streets, its libraries, its schools, its markets, all were consumed by the fury of conquest. Among the losses that would echo across centuries was the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, the great Abbasid library and intellectual center that had been founded in the late 8th century and transformed under the Caliph al-Ma'mun into the engine of the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars there had translated Greek, Syriac, and Persian texts into Arabic, producing advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy that shaped the entire medieval world. The Mongols sacked the House of Wisdom, along with every library in the city. Countless volumes were thrown into the Tigris River. Later chronicles described the river running dark with ink for days, an image so vivid it has persisted through centuries. Modern scholars debate the literal truth of this account, noting its physical improbability and the tendency of medieval writers toward powerful exaggeration. Yet the symbolic weight of the claim endures. Something irreplaceable was lost in those days. Not everything perished. The scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi reportedly rescued some 400,000 books before the destruction reached them, but the institution itself was gone. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed. Tradition holds that the Mongols wrapped him in a carpet and rode their horses over him, unwilling to spill royal blood directly. The Abbasid Caliphate, 5 centuries old, ended in silence. The fall of Baghdad did not mark the end of the Mongol advance. Hulagu's forces swept onward through Syria, taking Damascus, pushing towards the Levant. The world seemed to open before them, yet even the most formidable force carries within it the seeds of its own limitation. In September 1260, a Mongol army commanded by the general Kitbuka moved into the Jezreel Valley in what is now northern Israel, approaching the spring of Ain Jalut, a place of water and shade at the foot of Mount Gilboa. Waiting there was a Mamluk army from Egypt, led by Sultan Qutuz and his fierce commander Baybars, a man who had once been a slave and had risen through battlefield brilliance to become one of the most formidable soldiers of his age. The Mongol force was smaller than Hulagu's full strength. Supply lines had grown dangerously thin. The army had been reduced to what could be sustained far from its homeland pastures, a clear expression of the empire's strategic limits. Baybars fought with subtlety. He used hit-and-run strikes to exhaust the Mongol cavalry, then staged a deliberate retreat into terrain where Mamluk troops lay concealed. When the Mongols pursued, ambush closed around them from multiple directions. Kitbuka was killed. The Mongol force was routed. For the first time in open battle, a Mongol army had been decisively defeated. The westward expansion halted. The perception of Mongol invincibility, that long, terrifying shadow, began at last to recede. With the first cracks now visible in the armor of Mongol invincibility, the vast empire Genghis Khan had built began to fold inward upon itself, fracturing into competing kingdoms that would each carry a different piece of his world-altering legacy into the centuries ahead. Chapter 6. What the Ruins Remembered. In the summer of 1259, beneath the high walls of a fortified Chinese castle called Diao Yucheng, the Mongol Empire quietly began to come apart. Mongol Khan, the reigning Great Khan, died there during a prolonged siege. The circumstances were sudden and the succession was unclear. What had once been held together by a single commanding will now trembled without it. Almost immediately, Mongol's brothers turned against one another. Kublai and Arik Burqa entered into a prolonged civil war, known as the Toluid succession conflict, while further west, Burqa of the Golden Horde clashed with Hulagu of the Ilkhanate. The enormous fabric of the empire, which had once stretched from the Pacific to the edges of Eastern Europe, began slowly to separate at its seams. It did not collapse all at once. Rather, it drifted, the way a great river, diverted by the shape of the land, gradually separates into tributaries that each follow their own quiet course. 4 distinct Khanates emerge from this fragmentation: the Golden Horde in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in the east. Each carried something of the original empire forward. None could claim the whole. The 4 successor Khanates each carved their own identity from the ruins of the unified empire. In the northwest, the Golden Horde, founded by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, ruled the vast grasslands of what are now Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, pressing deep into the principalities of Eastern Europe. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate held the rich Transoxiana region, the Fergana Valley, and the territories that would one day become Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. To the southwest, Hulagu Khan's Ilkhanate governed Persia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and the Caucasus. And in the east, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty administered China proper, Mongolia, Korea, and portions of surrounding lands. Each Khanate governed differently. Each inherited a different landscape, a different people, a different set of pressures. They competed with one another and at times made war. Yet they all traced their lineage to the same frozen steppe, the same iron code of law, the same restless vision of a world connected by roads and loyalty. The empire that had once been one now breathed in 4 separate bodies, each exhaling the warmth of the original fire in its own direction. Of all the successor states, the Yuan dynasty represented the most deliberate transformation. Kublai Khan did not simply rule China. He sought to become Chinese in the manner of his governance. He moved the capital to Dadu, the city that would one day become Beijing. He adopted the Chinese name for his dynasty. He employed Confucian scholars in his administration, instituted a civil bureaucracy modeled on Chinese imperial tradition, introduced codified taxation, and issued paper currency. In Chinese portraiture, he was rendered as a sage emperor of the old tradition. And yet he preserved a strict ethnic hierarchy that placed Mongols and trusted foreign groups above the Han Chinese population, maintaining separate legal codes that protected Mongol privileges. This tension between assimilation and distance, between ruling a people and remaining apart from them, was never resolved. Traditionalist Mongols within the court deeply resented these changes. They clung to the Yasa, to the open steppe, to the customs that had made their ancestors conquerors rather than administrators. Conspiracies flickered at the edges of court life. Kublai Khan had built something extraordinary, but he had built it on a fault line, and future generations would feel the tremor. Even as Kublai Khan consolidated his power over China, he looked outward. The island kingdom of Japan lay beyond the sea, and in 1274 he sent a fleet of roughly 800 to 900 vessels, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from Mongol, Chinese, and Korean forces. The armada struck the islands of Tsushima and Iki before moving toward Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu. But before the full assault could be mounted, a sudden typhoon swept through the anchorage, shattering the fleet. Estimates suggest that between a third and two-thirds of the ships were lost, along with thousands of soldiers. The survivors fled or were captured. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai Khan tried again, and at a scale that dwarfed the first attempt. Two converging fleets totaling somewhere between 140,000 and 150,000 men, and thousands of ships, descended on Kyushu. Japanese defenders, having reinforced their coastal walls, held firm for 7 weeks of fierce fighting. Then the typhoon came again. The Mongol fleet was shattered. The vast armada dissolved into the sea. The Japanese named the storms kamikaze, divine wind, and the word carried the weight of something beyond ordinary fortune, a sense that the islands themselves had refused to yield. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai Khan had worked so carefully to build began to unravel in the generations that followed him. Institutionalized discrimination against the Han Chinese population bred deep resentment. Heavy taxation and monetary inflation strained ordinary lives. Then the Yellow River flooded catastrophically, displacing vast numbers of people. The Black Death, which moved along the very trade routes the Mongols had nurtured, further weakened the state and thinned its population. Out of this accumulation of suffering rose the Red Turban Rebellion, a widespread popular uprising that fragmented Yuan authority between 1351 and 1368. Among the rebel leaders who emerged from this chaos was a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, a former peasant who had survived famine as a child, joined the rebellion, and through military and political skill, eliminated rival warlords one by one. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself emperor of the Ming dynasty, adopting the reign title Hongwu. The Mongols were driven north, back toward the steppe from which their ancestors had come. Han Chinese rule was restored, and one of the first things the new dynasty chose to do was build a wall, not merely to mark a border, but to remember what had come through it. The Great Wall that the Ming dynasty extended and fortified was, in many ways, a monument to memory. After the devastating defeat at the Battle of Tumu in 1449, when Mongol forces captured a reigning Ming emperor in the field, the dynasty poured enormous resources into transforming the old earthen barriers of previous dynasties into something more formidable. Ming engineers shifted the wall's route to trace the southern edge of the Ordos Desert, constructed massive sections from brick and stone, and installed a dense network of up to 25,000 watchtowers, equipped with signal fires capable of transmitting warnings across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. Garrisons were positioned to respond quickly to cavalry raids. The entire system was designed specifically around the Mongol threat. The speed of mounted warriors, their ability to strike without warning, their preference for open terrain. In building the wall, the Ming were not simply defending a border. They were answering a century of Mongol rule with stone. Every watchtower was a statement. Every fortified pass was a resolved decision, never to be caught unguarded again. The wall did not erase the memory of what had come before it. In a way, it preserved that memory in permanent form, visible from the mountains and the plains below. To the west, the Golden Horde cast its long shadow over the Russian principalities for more than 2 centuries. Founded by Batu Khan and controlling a territory stretching from Siberian grasslands to the Danube frontier, the Horde imposed a tribute system administered through Mongol officials who supervised the Russian princes. The Grand Prince, who proved most capable of collecting and remitting taxes to the Khan, accumulated wealth, diplomatic leverage, and military experience. Advantages that accumulated slowly, like silt, into the foundations of a new power. That power was Moscow. Over generations, the Grand Duchy of Moscow grew wealthy as the Horde's primary tax collector. Its princes learned to negotiate with Khans, to balance submission with ambition. Victories at the Vosha River in 1378 and at Kulikovo in 1380 marked a turning point. Not yet freedom, but the beginning of a new confidence. The Mongol Yam relay network, which had been designed to transmit imperial commands across vast distances, was absorbed into Russian administrative practice. The model of centralized autocratic rule, a single ruler commanding loyalty and revenue from dispersed lands, passed from the steppe into the stone halls of Moscow. When the Horde finally fragmented in the late 15th century, Moscow was already prepared to fill the space it left behind. In the southwest, the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu Khan over the territories of present-day Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan and surrounding lands, underwent one of the quietest but most consequential transformations in Mongol history. The early Ilkhans had maintained the traditional mosaic of Mongol religious tolerance, honoring shamanism, Buddhism, and Christianity side by side. But the pressure of ruling a deeply Muslim Persian population and the political advantage of aligning with local elites gradually shifted the dynasty's spiritual orientation. A brief and short-lived conversion under the Ilkhan Tekuder in the 1280s gave way to something more lasting when Ghazan formally declared Islam the state religion in 1295. Issuing coins bearing the title Emperor of Islam and positioning himself within the cultural fabric of the region he governed. His brother Oljetu further deepened this transformation by converting to Shiite Islam in 1310. The Ilkhanate had begun as a Mongol conqueror ruling over Persia. It ended as a Persian Islamic dynasty with Mongol roots. The land had absorbed its rulers as quietly and completely as the desert absorbs rain. When the Ilkhanate finally dissolved in 1335, it left behind not the memory of conquest alone, but the deeper memory of transformation. The Pax Mongolica, the peace that the empire's vast reach had imposed upon Eurasian trade, carried more than silk and spices along its routes. It carried ideas. Gunpowder, first recorded by Chinese alchemists in the 7th century, traveled westward with Mongol armies and their engineers, appearing on Persian and Middle Eastern battlefields, and then on European ones by the 1320s. Paper, which had been invented in China centuries earlier, moved the same way, reaching Samarkand around the year 700, flourishing in Islamic cities like Baghdad, then flowing through North Africa and Spain into Europe, where it would eventually carry the words of the Renaissance. Paper money, first issued by the Song dynasty and expanded under the Yuan, traveled the same trade corridors and inspired early experiments in paper-based financial instruments in the Italian city-states. Islamic scholars, meanwhile, transmitted mathematical and astronomical knowledge, trigonometric tables, algebraic methods, refined astronomical instruments, eastward through the same networks under Mongol patronage. The trade routes were not merely roads. They were channels through which the knowledge of one civilization quietly entered the bloodstream of another. The Mongol Empire built these channels not out of any vision of cultural exchange, but the exchange happened anyway, the way water finds its own level. The same trade routes that carried knowledge also carried death. The Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, swept across Eurasia between roughly 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. Historical accounts describe Mongol forces at the siege of Kaffa in Crimea catapulting plague-infected corpses into the city, after which fleeing Genoese merchants carried the disease by ship to Sicily and then across Europe. Modern genetic studies of ancient plague DNA have traced a common Central Asian lineage consistent with transmission along the very Silk Road corridors the Mongol Empire had stabilized. The toll was staggering. Europe lost between 30 and 60% of its population. The Islamic world lost roughly a third. China, already weakened by Mongol conquest and political instability, lost perhaps 15 to 30% of its population in the mid-14th century alone. The connected world the Pax Mongolica had created did not distinguish between the goods it moved. It carried the plague as efficiently as it carried porcelain. The great irony of the Mongol achievement was this: the same peace that allowed civilization to breathe and expand across continents also allowed something invisible and lethal to travel further and faster than it ever had before. What the ruins remembered was not simple. Modern scholarship has had to sit with that complexity carefully. For centuries, historians in the Islamic world, China and Russia, wrote of the Mongols primarily as destroyers. And they were not wrong. Cities had been leveled, populations had been scattered. The Abbasid Caliphate, whose fall in 1258 ended the model of a single, universal Islamic authority. left behind a mosaic of competing dynasties that defined Islamic governance for centuries afterward. The modern borders of Russia, China, Iran, Iraq, and the 5 Central Asian republics all carry the shape of Mongol-era divisions within them, written into the landscape like the memory of old walls. Yet modern scholars, among them Thomas Olson, Morris Rosabi, Peter Jackson, and others who have worked with the secret history of the Mongols and the growing evidence of archaeology and genetics, have described something more than destruction. They have described a dual force, catastrophic in its violence, constructive in its reach. Religious freedom as state policy. Merit-based administration drawn from multiple cultures. A postal relay network that became the model for later communications. Technologies and ideas crossing continents. A 2003 genetic study found that roughly 16 million men alive today may carry the Y chromosome signature of a single Central Asian ancestor from roughly 1,000 years ago, though later ancient DNA research has complicated that attribution, suggesting the lineage's origins are more difficult to trace than first imagined. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan remains a founding father, his image on currency and stone. In much of the rest of the world, he remains a shadow of fire and ruin. Both are pieces of something real. And so the story of Genghis Khan and the empire he built ends not with silence, but with a question that echoes across every century that followed. When we look at the connected world we live in today, at its trade routes and its pluralism and its relay of transmitted ideas, how much of what we call the modern world was first imagined on a frozen Mongolian steppe by an abandoned boy who refused to disappear?